Cop accuses man of stealing his own car, then realizes his mistake in a big way. The sun was setting over the city, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple as Officer Jake Matheson began his evening patrol. The familiar weight of his badge pressed against his chest, a constant reminder of the responsibility he carried. He'd been on the force for 8 years now, and every shift still felt as important as his first day on the job. Before we can continue, if you love your family, subscribe to this channel to help up creating amazing stories. Now, let's continue. Jake drove slowly through the winding streets of the upscale Garden Heights neighborhood, his eyes scanning the perfectly manicured lawns and elegant homes. The autumn air had turned crisp, and fallen leaves skittered across the pavement in front of his patrol car. He noticed Mrs. Henderson walking her poodle, the same routine she kept every evening at 6, and gave her a small wave as he passed. The job had changed him over the years, molding him into someone who noticed every detail, every slight variation in the normal pattern of things. Some might call him rigid or overly cautious, but Jake preferred to think of himself as thorough. His fellow officers sometimes joked about his by-the-book approach, but his supervisor appreciated his dedication. Jake had never missed a shift, never called in sick, and often volunteered for extra patrols when others wanted time off. As he turned onto Maple Drive, something caught his attention. A black Mercedes sat idling at a stop sign, its engine purring quietly in the growing darkness. Jake slowed his patrol car, watching. In his experience, people usually came to a complete stop for maybe 3 seconds before moving on. This car had been sitting there for at least 30 seconds. His mind quickly ran through the recent reports from the morning briefing. There had been a string of car thefts in the neighboring districts, mostly high-end vehicles like the one in front of him. The thieves were getting bolder, moving into more affluent areas. Jake straightened in his seat, years of training kicking in as he observed the situation. The Mercedes had dark tinted windows, making it impossible to see the driver clearly. The car looked new, its black paint gleaming under the streetlights that had just flickered on. Jake noticed there was no front license plate, which wasn't necessarily suspicious in their state, but combined with everything else, it made him uneasy. He reached for his radio, calling in his location and the situation. "Dispatch, this is Officer Matheson. I'm on Maple Drive in Garden Heights, about to conduct a traffic stop on a black Mercedes, possible suspicious activity." The dispatcher's voice crackled back, acknowledging his call. Jake flipped on his lights, watching as the blue and red reflections bounced off the Mercedes' shiny surface. The car's brake lights brightened slightly as the driver noticed the patrol car behind them. To Jake's satisfaction, the vehicle pulled over smoothly to the curb, suggesting the driver was familiar with traffic stops. He took a moment to adjust his body camera and check his equipment before stepping out of his patrol car. The evening had grown cooler, and Jake could see his breath in the air as he approached the Mercedes. His right hand rested near his holstered weapon, a habit born from years of experience and countless training sessions. The tinted window of the Mercedes began to lower with a soft mechanical whir. Jake's fingers tensed slightly on his holster, ready for anything. But as the window descended, he found himself looking at a young man who appeared to be in his early 30s, dressed in a casual sweater and looking completely at ease. The man's relaxed demeanor struck Jake as odd. In his experience, people usually showed some signs of nervousness when pulled over, even if they hadn't done anything wrong. This guy looked like he was waiting in a drive-thru for his coffee order. The casual attitude only reinforced Jake's suspicions. Jake positioned himself slightly behind the driver's door, maintaining what he considered a safe distance. The smell of expensive leather wafted from the car's interior, mixing with the crisp autumn air. Street lights cast long shadows across the scene, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. "Good evening, sir," Jake said, using his authoritative voice, the one he'd perfected over years of traffic stops. "I'm Officer Matheson with the City Police Department." He paused, studying the driver's face in the glow of the dashboard lights. The man looked back at him with clear, steady eyes. "Is there a problem, officer?" the driver asked, his tone casual and friendly. Jake noticed his hands were placed on the steering wheel at 10 and 2, exactly where they should be. It seemed almost too perfect, like someone who had studied what to do in this situation. I noticed you were stopped at that sign for quite a while, Jake said, his eyes scanning the car's interior. Everything looked pristine, not a wrapper or receipt in sight. Most people's cars had some sign of daily life in them, coffee cups, shopping bags, something. This car looked like it had just rolled off the showroom floor. The young man nodded, his expression unchanged. I was just checking a text message before driving off, he said. I know we're not supposed to look at our phones while driving. He smiled slightly, as though sharing a joke with Jake. That explanation made sense, but something still felt off to Jake. Maybe it was the way the man seemed too comfortable, too prepared. Or maybe it was just Jake's instincts, honed by years of patrol work, telling him to dig deeper. I'll need to see your license and registration, Jake said, keeping his tone professional but firm. The interior light clicked on as the driver reached for the glove compartment, and Jake's hand tightened slightly on his holster. He'd seen enough traffic stops go bad to know that moments like these could turn dangerous in an instant. Of course, officer, the man replied, his movements slow and deliberate as he retrieved the documents. Jake noticed his hands were steady. No trembling, no nervous fumbling with the papers. Most people showed at least a little anxiety during traffic stops, even when they had nothing to hide. The driver held out the documents, and Jake took them, noticing the quality of the leather wallet. Everything about this guy spoke of money, the car, the clothes, the accessories. But in Jake's experience, that didn't always mean everything was legitimate. Sometimes it meant quite the opposite. He studied the license under his flashlight beam. David Carter, the name read, with an address right here in Garden Heights. The photo matched the face looking up at him from the driver's seat, but Jake had seen plenty of good fakes in his time. The registration looked proper too, listing the same name as owner of the vehicle. Jake's mind worked through the possibilities. If the car was stolen, it had been taken recently enough that the thieves hadn't had time to switch the plates. Or maybe this was something else entirely, drug dealing, burglary reconnaissance, or any number of other crimes he'd encountered in seemingly quiet neighborhoods like this one. The whole situation just didn't sit right with him. 8 years on the force had taught Jake to trust his gut, and right now his gut was telling him something was wrong. He decided to push a little harder, see if he could get this David Carter to crack if he was indeed hiding something. Looking back at the driver, Jake noticed the man was watching him calmly, still maintaining that irritatingly relaxed demeanor. The street had grown quieter, and Jake could hear crickets chirping in the well-maintained gardens of the nearby homes. A cool breeze rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of someone's fireplace. Jake cleared his throat, preparing to dig deeper into what he was convinced was a suspicious situation. He didn't realize that his own biases were about to lead him down a path that would change not just this evening, but his entire approach to his job and his understanding of the community he served. Mr. Carter, Jake began, his flashlight beams still illuminating the documents in his hand. Mind explaining what you're doing in this neighborhood at this hour? He kept his voice level but firm, the way he'd been trained to handle suspicious subjects. David shifted slightly in his leather seat, and for the first time, Jake detected a hint of irritation crossing his features. Like I mentioned, officer, I live here. That address on my license? That's my house right there. He pointed up the street to a large colonial-style home with warm lights glowing in the windows. I was just making sure everything was locked up before heading out to dinner. Jake's eyes followed David's gesture to the house, then back to the man himself. The explanation was perfectly reasonable, yet something about David's composure continued to nag at him. In his experience, even innocent people showed some nervousness during police stops. This guy was too calm, too collected. And you always drive a car this nice? Jake asked, immediately regretting how the question sounded. But he pressed on anyway. It's just that we've had some high-end vehicle thefts in the area recently. You understand why I need to be thorough. David's eyebrows rose slightly. Yes, I always drive this nice of a car because it's my car, Officer Matheson. His voice remained steady, but there was an edge to it now. I worked hard for it, and I've owned it for the past 2 years. Would you like to see the purchase documentation? I keep it in my home office. Jake ignored the slight sarcasm in David's voice. That won't be necessary right now, sir. I'm just going to run your plates real quick. Standard procedure. He stepped back slightly, speaking into his radio while keeping his eyes on David. "Dispatch, can I get a check on plate number XRJ 4729? While waiting for a response, Jake noticed David pull out his phone. "Sir, please keep your hands where I can see them," he said sharply. David looked up, genuine surprise crossing his face. "Officer, I was just going to call the restaurant to let them know I'll be late for my reservation." "Is that not allowed?" "I'd prefer if you waited until we're finished here," Jake replied, his suspicion growing with each passing moment. Someone with nothing to hide wouldn't be so eager to make a phone call during a traffic stop, would they? The radio crackled to life. "Unit 247, plate XRJ 4729 comes back clean. Registered to David Carter. Current address matches driver's license." The dispatcher's voice was clear in the quiet evening air. Jake frowned slightly. Everything was checking out, but his instincts were still screaming that something wasn't right. He'd seen too many perfect-looking situations turn bad in his career. Maybe the car had been stolen so recently it hadn't been reported yet. Maybe the documentation was forged. There had to be something he was missing. "Mr. Carter, what do you do for a living?" Jake asked, shining his flashlight back into the car's interior. The beam caught the gleam of an expensive watch on David's wrist, another detail that seemed too perfect. David's patience was visibly wearing thin now, though his voice remained controlled. "I'm an investment banker with Morrison and Associates downtown. I've worked there for 6 years. Would you like their phone number to verify that as well?" The slight challenge in David's tone made Jake bristle. He'd dealt with plenty of entitled attitudes in this neighborhood before, people who thought their wealth put them above questioning. "Sir, I'm just doing my job here. There's no need for attitude." "And I'm just trying to go to dinner," David responded, his calm facade finally showing cracks of frustration. "I've shown you my license, registration, and insurance. Your dispatch confirmed the car is mine. What else do you need to see?" A light came on in a house across the street, and Jake could see curtains moving in several windows. The stop was starting to draw attention, which wasn't unusual in this kind of neighborhood. People here tended to be nosy about police activity, probably because it was so rare. Jake took a deep breath, trying to maintain his professional demeanor. "Mr. Carter, you have to understand that we've had several incidents in this area recently. When I see a vehicle sitting at a stop sign for an extended period in a neighborhood known for recent car thefts, it's my duty to investigate." David's hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel, his knuckles whitening. "Officer Matheson, I want to be very clear about something. I've lived in this house for 5 years. I know every neighbor on this street. Mrs. Peterson across the way is probably watching right now, wondering why one of her book club members is being treated like a criminal." As if on cue, the front door of the house David had indicated opened, and an elderly woman stepped onto her porch. She stood there watching, her arms crossed over her chest. Jake could feel the weight of her stare on his back. "Look," David continued, his voice taking on a tired quality, "I understand you're doing your job. But at what point does being thorough become something else entirely? Because right now, it feels like you're looking for a problem that doesn't exist." Jake felt a flicker of uncertainty for the first time since initiating the stop. He glanced down at the license and registration again, then at the house David had pointed out, its windows warm and inviting in the growing darkness. The documentation was in order, the plates checked out, and now there was a neighbor watching who potentially knew the driver. But years of training and experience had taught Jake to trust his instincts, and something still felt off. Maybe it was the way David had been sitting at the stop sign, or his too perfect responses to questioning. Or maybe Jake's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a screen door closing. Another neighbor had emerged from their house, a middle-aged man in a cardigan, walking purposefully toward them. Behind him, a woman stood on the porch, phone in hand. "Everything okay out here?" the man called as he approached. "David, we saw the lights and got worried." Jake turned slightly, keeping both David and the approaching neighbor in his view. This was starting to get complicated. More lights were coming on in nearby houses, and he could see faces peering out through windows. David's voice carried a note of relief as he responded to his neighbor. "I'm fine, Mr. Richards. Officer Matheson here is just being thorough about a traffic stop. The emphasis he placed on the word thorough wasn't lost on Jake. Mr. Richards stopped a respectful distance from the patrol car, but fixed Jake with a questioning look. David's lived here for years, officer. He's on the neighborhood council. Is there some kind of problem? Jake felt the situation shifting beneath his feet. What had started as a routine traffic stop based on suspicious behavior was quickly turning into something else entirely. He could feel the eyes of the gathering neighbors on him, could sense their unspoken questions and judgments. More doors were opening now. A woman with her teenage son had joined Mrs. Peterson on her porch. An elderly couple stood arm in arm in their driveway, whispering to each other as they watched the scene unfold. The quiet evening had become an impromptu neighborhood gathering, with Jake's patrol car and David's Mercedes at the center of it all. The weight of all those watching eyes made Jake's collar feel tight. He looked down at the documents in his hand one more time, then at David, who met his gaze steadily. In the growing crowd of neighbors, Jake saw nothing but recognition and concern when they looked at David. There were no suspicious glances, no signs of uncertainty about his presence in the neighborhood. The realization of his mistake began to sink in, bringing with it a cold, uncomfortable feeling in the pit of his stomach. He had let his assumptions and training override common sense, had seen suspicion where there was none, had turned a simple moment of caution at a stop sign into something much more significant. Despite the growing evidence that he had misjudged the situation, Jake found himself unable to simply back down. Years of training had taught him to maintain control of every situation, and right now, that meant standing his ground, even as doubt crept into his mind. "Sir, I still need to complete my investigation," Jake said, his voice carrying across the now quiet street. He could hear the rustle of leaves in the evening breeze, the soft murmur of neighbors talking among themselves. "Could you step out of the vehicle, please?" A collective intake of breath seemed to ripple through the gathering crowd. David's expression, which had maintained a remarkable level of composure throughout the encounter, finally showed clear signs of anger. "Officer Matheson, are you serious right now? On what grounds are you asking me to exit my vehicle?" Jake's heart was pounding, but he kept his voice steady. "Sir, I need you to comply with my request. It's a standard procedure when we're investigating potential vehicle theft." Potential vehicle theft. David's voice rose slightly, disbelief evident in his tone. "Officer, you've run my plates. You've checked my license and registration. Multiple neighbors have confirmed who I am. What more do you need?" Mr. Richards took a step forward, his face creased with concern. "Officer, this is getting ridiculous. I've known David for years. He coaches my grandson's basketball team at the community center. Whatever you think is happening here, you're mistaken." Jake felt sweat forming on his forehead despite the cool evening air. The situation was spiraling, but his training kept pushing him forward. "Sir, please step out of the vehicle," he repeated, his hand unconsciously moving closer to his holster. David noticed the movement and slowly raised his hands from the steering wheel, keeping them visible. "Officer, I want to be very clear about something. I'm going to reach for my phone now, and I'm going to call my lawyer. This has gone far enough." "Sir, do not reach for anything," Jake commanded, his voice sharper now. "I need you to exit the vehicle first." More neighbors had gathered, forming a loose semicircle around the scene. Mrs. Peterson had made her way down her driveway, her house slippers shuffling on the pavement. "Young man," she called out to Jake, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had lived in the neighborhood longer than Jake had been alive, "this is completely unnecessary. David is having dinner at my house tomorrow night. We're discussing the upcoming charity auction for the children's hospital." Jake felt trapped. Every instinct from his training was telling him to maintain control, to see this through. But another voice, one he wasn't used to listening to, was screaming that he was making a terrible mistake. The conflict between these competing impulses left him frozen in place, his flashlight beam steady on David's face. David's phone began to ring, making everyone jump slightly. "That's probably the restaurant wondering where I am," David said quietly. "May I answer it, officer? Or would that also be suspicious behavior?" The sarcasm in David's voice stung, but it was the quiet dignity beneath it that really got to Jake. Here was a man being humiliated in front of his neighbors, yet he was maintaining a level of composure that Jake himself was struggling to match. More cars were slowing as they passed the scene, some even stopping. The neighborhood was usually chill. Yet at this hour, and the sight of a police car with its lights flashing had drawn attention. Jake could see people taking out their phones, presumably recording the incident. This was quickly becoming the kind of situation that ended up on the news, and not in a good way. "Listen," David said, his voice now carrying a weight of exhaustion. "I understand you're trying to do your job. But at some point, you need to ask yourself what evidence you actually have that anything is wrong here. Because from where I'm sitting, in my car, in my neighborhood, surrounded by my neighbors, the only thing suspicious about this situation is why it's still going on." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. He could feel his certainty crumbling, replaced by a growing sense of embarrassment and shame. But professional pride and years of ingrained training made it hard to simply admit he was wrong. "Sir, I still need to verify," Jake began, but was cut off by another voice from the crowd. "Verify what?" This came from a teenage boy standing with his mother. "Mr. Carter helped me with my college applications last week. He's lived here forever. What are you even looking for?" Jake's radio crackled to life, making him jump slightly. "Unit 247, do you need assistance at your location?" The dispatcher's voice was professional but carried a note of concern. They had probably noticed how long this routine traffic stop was taking. Before Jake could respond, another car pulled up to the scene. This one was familiar. It belonged to his sergeant, Sarah Martinez. Jake felt his stomach drop as she stepped out of her vehicle, taking in the scene with experienced eyes. "Everything okay here, Matheson?" Martinez asked, her voice calm, but carrying an edge of authority. She looked from Jake to David, then at the gathered crowd of neighbors. David spoke before Jake could answer. "Sergeant, I've been detained here for nearly 30 minutes now. Officer Matheson seems convinced that I've stolen my own car, despite multiple forms of identification and several neighbors confirming my identity. I was simply checking my phone at a stop sign before heading out to dinner." Martinez's expression remained neutral, but Jake could see the slight tightening around her eyes that meant she wasn't happy. She turned to the crowd of neighbors. "Can anyone here verify this gentleman's identity?" Multiple voices spoke up at once. Mrs. Peterson stepped forward again. "I've known David for 5 years. He's on the neighborhood council. This is absolutely ridiculous." Mr. Richards added, "David's been a pillar of this community since he moved here. He volunteers at the youth center, helps organize charity events. There's been some kind of mistake here." Jake watched as his sergeant processed this information, feeling smaller with each passing moment. The weight of his mistake was becoming unbearable. He had let his preconceptions and training override common sense and basic human decency. Martinez turned to Jake, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "Matheson, I think we're done here. Wrap it up." Jake nodded, feeling a mix of relief and shame. He turned back to David, who was still sitting calmly in his car, though the tension in his shoulders was visible. "Mr. Carter, you're free to go. I apologize for the delay." The words felt inadequate, empty in the face of what had just transpired. David looked at him for a long moment, then simply nodded. The gathered neighbors began to disperse, some shaking their heads, others casting disapproving looks in Jake's direction. As David prepared to drive away, Jake caught a glimpse of his face in the rearview mirror. There was no anger there, just a profound weariness that made Jake's chest tight with guilt. He had caused that weariness, had turned a simple evening into something much darker. Jake stood rooted to the spot as David's taillights disappeared around the corner. The neighbors were slowly dispersing, but their disapproving glances and whispered conversations felt like physical blows. Sergeant Martinez still stood nearby, her presence a reminder of just how badly he had handled the situation. "Walk with me, Matheson," Martinez said, gesturing toward their patrol cars. The street lights cast long shadows as they moved away from the lingering observers. Jake's throat felt dry, his uniform suddenly uncomfortable against his skin. "Tell me what happened here," Martinez said, her voice level but carrying an undercurrent of concern. She wasn't just a supervisor. She'd been his field training officer when he first joined the force. Jake ran a hand through his hair, the events of the last hour playing through his mind like a bad movie. I saw the car at the stop sign. Thought it looked suspicious. Recent car thefts in the area, you know? But then, he trailed off, the weight of his assumptions hitting him all at once. Then you let your training override your judgment. Martinez finished for him. She wasn't angry, which somehow made it worse. Jake, I know what they teach at the academy. I know about staying alert, trusting your instincts. But there's a difference between being cautious and being biased. Jake finished quietly. The word tasted bitter in his mouth. I saw what I expected to see, didn't I? Nice car, tinted windows, young guy in an upscale neighborhood. I created a story in my head and then tried to make everything fit into it. A cool breeze rustled through the trees, carrying the sound of doors closing as the last few neighbors headed inside. Some were still watching from their windows, probably wondering what would happen next. Jake wondered the same thing. You know what the worst part is? He continued, staring at the ground. He was nothing but polite. Even when I was treating him like a criminal in front of his own neighbors, he kept his cool. I kept waiting for him to slip up, to show some sign that my suspicions were right, but the only person who acted inappropriately was me. Martinez leaned against her patrol car, her expression thoughtful. You remember what I told you during your first week on patrol? About how this job can either make you better or bitter? Jake nodded. It had been one of her favorite sayings during his training. You said we have to choose which way we let it shape us. This is one of those choosing moments, Jake, she said, gesturing toward the now quiet street. What happened here tonight? It's not great, but it's how you handle it going forward that matters. Some officers would double down, try to justify their actions. Others might let it eat at them until they can't do the job anymore. Neither of those is the right answer. The truth of her words sank in slowly. Jake thought about David's face in the rearview mirror, that look of weary resignation that suggested this wasn't the first time he'd experienced something like this. The realization made Jake's stomach turn. I need to make this right, Jake said finally, looking up at his sergeant. I don't know how, but I can't just let it end like this. Martinez nodded slowly. That's a start. But Jake, making it right isn't just about apologizing to one person. It's about understanding why this happened and making sure it doesn't happen again. They both turned as another car drove past, slowing slightly as the driver took in the sight of two police officers having what appeared to be a serious conversation. Jake wondered if word of tonight's events was already spreading through the neighborhood's social circles. You know what really gets me? Jake said after the car had passed. All those neighbors who came out, they weren't just defending him because he lives here. Did you hear what they were saying? He coaches kids, helps with college applications, organizes charity events. He's actually making a difference in this community, while He gestured helplessly at his patrol car with its flashing lights still reflecting off the nearby houses. While you're what? Martinez pressed. Doing your job? Protecting the community? That's still true, Jake. But maybe tonight is teaching you something about what protection really means. Sometimes it's about knowing when not to act, when to trust what you're seeing rather than what you're expecting to see. Jake thought about all the traffic stops he'd conducted over the years, all the times he'd approached vehicles with his hand near his weapon, expecting the worst. How many times had he missed seeing the actual person behind the wheel because he was too focused on potential threats? I've got some thinking to do, he admitted. The night air had grown colder, and Jake could see his breath forming small clouds as he spoke. A lot of thinking, actually. Martinez pushed herself away from her car. Good. That's exactly what you should be doing. But Jake, don't just think about it. Do something about it. The community needs officers who can learn and grow from their mistakes, not ones who let them fester. She was right, of course. Jake knew he couldn't just go back to patrolling these streets the same way he had before. Tonight had shown him a blind spot in his approach to policing, one that he couldn't ignore now that he was aware of it. As he watched Martinez drive away, Jake remained standing beside his patrol car, lost in thought. The neighborhood had grown quiet again, the earlier commotion nothing but a memory now. But for Jake, The echoes of what had happened would likely stay with him for a long time. He thought about David Carter, probably explaining to the restaurant why he'd missed his reservation, maybe telling friends or family about his encounter with law enforcement. The thought made Jake wince. He had to find a way to make this right, not just for David's sake, but for his own. The next morning found Jake sitting in his car outside the Garden Heights police substation, his hands wrapped around a cooling cup of coffee. He hadn't slept well, his mind replaying the previous night's events on an endless loop. The morning briefing would start in 15 minutes, but he couldn't bring himself to go inside just yet. His phone sat on the passenger seat, open to the local community Facebook page. Word had spread about the incident, though thankfully no video had surfaced. The comments ranged from angry to disappointed, with several residents sharing their own stories of feeling unfairly targeted by law enforcement. Jake had forced himself to read every single one. A knock on his window startled him. It was Officer Chun, his usual patrol partner. "You coming in? Martinez wants to talk to you before briefing." Jake nodded, gathering his things. The station felt different this morning, or maybe he was just more aware of the looks he was getting. News traveled fast in a department this size, and everyone had probably heard about last night by now. Martinez was waiting in her office, a stack of papers on her desk and dark circles under her eyes suggesting she'd had about as much sleep as Jake. She gestured for him to close the door. "I've been thinking about how to handle this," she said without preamble. "The incident report from last night is pretty straightforward, but we both know there's more to it than what's on paper." Jake sat down heavily in the chair across from her desk. "I want to apologize to him. Properly, I mean, not just the quick sorry for the delay I gave him last night." Martinez nodded slowly. "That's good. But Jake, I need to know something first. What exactly did you learn from this?" The question hung in the air between them. Jake had been asking himself the same thing all night. "I learned that I've been operating on autopilot," he said finally. "Following procedures, trusting my training, but not really seeing the people I'm supposed to be serving. I assumed the worst because that's what we're trained to expect, but in doing that, I became part of the problem instead of the solution." He paused, collecting his thoughts. "The thing is, last night wasn't just about me making a mistake. It was about the impact that mistake had on someone else. David Carter didn't just experience an inconvenient traffic stop. He was humiliated in front of his neighbors, made to feel like a criminal in his own community. And the worst part is, I get the feeling this wasn't the first time something like this has happened to him." Martinez leaned back in her chair, studying him. "So, what are you going to do about it?" "First, I need to apologize to Mr. Carter. Not just because it's the right thing to do, but because I need him to know that his experience matters, that it's going to change how I approach my job." Jake ran a hand through his hair, feeling the weight of what he was about to say. "And then, I think I need to take a hard look at how I've been doing this job. Maybe talk to community leaders, get their perspective on what good policing actually looks like from their side." Martinez's phone buzzed, interrupting their conversation. She glanced at it, then looked back at Jake with raised eyebrows. "Well, this is interesting. I just got an email from David Carter. He's requesting a meeting with both of us." Jake felt his stomach tighten. What does he want? He doesn't say specifically, just that he'd like to discuss last night's incident in person. She studied Jake's face. "Are you up for that?" Jake nodded without hesitation. "Yes. Whatever he has to say, I need to hear it." The meeting was set for that afternoon at a local coffee shop, neutral ground that wasn't Carter's neighborhood or the police station. Jake arrived early, watching through the window as people went about their daily routines, completely unaware of the knots in his stomach. David Carter arrived exactly on time, dressed in a crisp business suit that suggested he'd come straight from work. Martinez was already there, and they all sat down at a corner table with their coffees. "Thank you for meeting with me," David began, his voice carrying the same calm dignity it had the night before. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened last night, and I've come to a decision." Jake braced himself, expecting talk of formal complaints or legal action. But David surprised him. "I'm not interested in filing grievances or creating more division," David continued. "What I am interested in is finding ways to bridge the gap between law enforcement and our community. That's actually why I wanted to meet with both of you." He pulled out his phone, showing them a calendar. This weekend, we're having a community gathering at the neighborhood center. It's something we do every month. Families come together, share food, talk about local issues. Usually, the police aren't part of these conversations, but maybe they should be. Jake looked at him in surprise. You're inviting us to attend? David nodded. More than that, I'm inviting you to be part of the conversation. To listen to people's experiences, share your own perspective, and maybe help us find a better way forward. He paused, looking directly at Jake. Last night showed me that we need more dialogue, not less. More understanding, not more barriers. The offer hung in the air between them. Jake felt a mix of emotions: gratitude for the unexpected opportunity, anxiety about facing the community he'd wronged, and something else, something that felt like hope. Martinez spoke up. That's a generous offer, Mr. Carter, especially given the circumstances. David shrugged slightly. Maybe. Or maybe it's just practical. We all have to live in this community together. We can either let incidents like last night drive us further apart, or we can use them as opportunities to do better. Jake found his voice. I would be honored to attend. And Mr. Carter, I want to apologize properly for last night. My actions were dash. David held up a hand, stopping him. Save it for the gathering. Let the whole community hear it. Show them that change is possible, that their voices matter. That would mean more than any private apology. Saturday arrived faster than Jake expected, bringing with it clear skies and the kind of crisp autumn weather that usually drew people outdoors. He sat in his car outside the neighborhood center, watching families stream in with covered dishes and folding chairs. He'd chosen to wear civilian clothes, jeans, and a sweater, rather than his uniform. Today wasn't about being Officer Matheson, it was about being Jake. The sound of children laughing drifted across the parking lot, mixing with the smell of grilling food and the distant thump of music. Jake recognized some faces from that night. Mrs. Peterson was setting up a table of desserts, and Mr. Richards was helping to organize a group of kids playing basketball on the center's court. Didn't think you'd actually come. The voice made Jake jump. David stood beside his car window, holding a cup of coffee. He offered one to Jake. Thought you might need this. Jake stepped out of his car, accepting the coffee gratefully. Thanks. And yeah, I almost didn't. Kept thinking maybe it would be better to let things cool down first. David nodded toward the gathering crowd. Things don't cool down by avoiding them. They cool down when we face them head-on. He started walking toward the center, and Jake fell into step beside him. The conversations nearby quieted as they approached, replaced by curious glances and whispered comments. Jake felt his face grow warm, but David seemed unfazed. He led Jake to a circle of chairs where several people were already seated, including some familiar faces from that night. Everyone, David announced, this is Jake Matheson. Some of you know him as Officer Matheson, but today he's here as our neighbor, to listen and learn. He turned to Jake. Would you like to say something? Jake looked around the circle, meeting the eyes of people who had witnessed his mistake. His throat felt dry, but he forced himself to speak. I'm here because I messed up. Not just that night, but in how I've been approaching my job in general. I've been so focused on looking for threats that I stopped seeing people. Real people, with lives and stories and contributions to this community that I never bothered to learn about. An elderly man Jake recognized from that night spoke up. Young man, do you know what David does here in the community? Besides being a successful banker? Jake shook his head, and the man continued. He started a mentoring program for kids who can't afford college prep courses. Helps them with applications, essays, everything. My grandson is going to college next year because of David's help. Others began sharing stories, how David had organized fundraisers for families facing medical bills, how he volunteered at the local youth center, how he'd helped start a neighborhood watch program that actually brought people together instead of making them suspicious of each other. That's the guy you pulled over, Mrs. Peterson said firmly. That's who you saw as a threat. Jake felt the weight of their words, but noticed something else too. They weren't speaking with anger. There was disappointment, yes, but also a desire to help him understand. They wanted him to see what he had missed that night. A teenage boy who had been listening quietly spoke up. "Mr. Carter helped me with my college essays last month. I was writing about wanting to become a police officer, actually." He looked at Jake. "But stuff like what happened, it makes me wonder if that's really what I want to do." The comment hit Jake hard. He turned to the boy. "What's your name?" "Marcus." "Marcus, can I tell you something? The kind of officer you want to be, someone who understands their community, who sees people as people first, that's exactly what we need more of."
"What happened that night?"
"That's what we need to change." David nodded. "And that's partly why we're all here today. Change doesn't happen in isolation. It happens when we take the time to understand each other's perspectives." The conversation continued as more people joined the circle. Jake heard stories of other encounters with law enforcement, some good, many not so good. He listened as parents talked about their fears for their children, as elderly residents described feeling unsafe not because of crime, but because of misunderstandings with police. As the afternoon wore on, people began sharing food and drinks. Kids played nearby, their laughter providing a soundtrack to the serious discussions taking place. Jake found himself drawn into conversations about community policing, about what safety really meant to different people, about how to build trust between law enforcement and residents. David's parents arrived later in the day, and Jake watched as they embraced their son. David's father, a distinguished-looking man with gray at his temples, approached Jake. "My son told me about what happened," he said quietly. "But he also told me you came here today, willing to learn. That takes courage." Jake shook his head. "Not as much courage as it takes to face situations like that with dignity. Your son, he handled it better than I would have." David's father smiled sadly. "He's had practice. Too much practice. But maybe that's changing. Maybe conversations like this are the start of something new." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the community center's lawn, Jake found himself sitting with David again. They watched as families began packing up, kids making last-minute plays on the basketball court, neighbors exchanging hugs and promises to get together soon. "Thank you," Jake said simply, "for giving me this chance, for turning what I did into something positive." David was quiet for a moment. "You know what the hardest part was that night? Not the stop itself. It was seeing the looks on those kids' faces, kids I mentor, kids I coach. They saw someone they knew, someone they respected, being treated like a criminal. That stays with them." Jake nodded, understanding dawning. But today they saw something else. They saw that people can learn, can change. That mistakes don't have to be the end of the story. "Exactly," David said, standing up. "And that's worth more than any apology." The weeks following the community gathering brought subtle but significant changes to Jake's approach to his job. Each patrol felt different now, colored by the stories and perspectives he'd heard that day. He found himself noticing things he'd overlooked before. The elderly man walking his dog who always waved at patrol cars, the teenagers shooting hoops in their driveway, the family having dinner on their front porch. One afternoon, while driving through Garden Heights, Jake spotted a group of kids playing basketball at the community center. He recognized Marcus among them, the teenager who talked about wanting to become a police officer. After a moment's hesitation, Jake pulled over. The game slowed as he approached, the kids watching him cautiously. But Marcus broke into a smile. "Officer Matheson, wanna play?" Jake glanced at his watch. He still had 30 minutes left on his break. "Sure, but fair warning, I haven't played in years." The kids quickly divided into teams, and Jake found himself defending against Marcus, who turned out to be surprisingly quick. Between plays, they talked about school, about Marcus's college applications, about what it really meant to serve a community. "You know," Marcus said during a water break, "I was serious about becoming a cop. But I want to do it differently. Like, actually know the people I'm protecting, you know?" Jake nodded, wiping sweat from his forehead. "That's exactly how it should be. Hey, have you thought about joining our youth outreach program? We could use someone with your perspective." The idea sparked something in Jake's mind. After his shift, he stopped by Sergeant Martinez's office. "I've been thinking about the youth program we run," he said. "What if we expanded it? Made it more about building relationships than just giving presentations?" Martinez leaned back in her chair, interested. "What did you have in mind?" Weekly basketball games, maybe? Or homework help sessions. Something that lets officers and kids actually get to know each other. And he hesitated before continuing. I thought maybe David Carter might be willing to help coordinate. He already does so much with the local kids. To his surprise, Martinez smiled. Funny you should mention that. David actually called me yesterday with a similar idea. He's been thinking about ways to bridge the gap between local youth and law enforcement. The next day, Jake found himself sitting with David at the same coffee shop where they'd met after the incident. They spent hours brainstorming ideas for the program, sports events, mentoring sessions, community service projects that would bring officers and local youth together. The key is consistency, David explained, sketching out a rough schedule. These kids need to see officers as real people, not just uniforms. And officers need to see these kids as individuals, not statistics. Jake watched David work, amazed at his dedication. Why are you doing this? After what happened, David looked up from his notes. Because what happened doesn't have to define our future relationship with law enforcement. Because these kids deserve better than growing up afraid of the people who were supposed to protect them. And because you proved that change is possible. The program launched 2 weeks later, starting small with twice-weekly basketball games and study sessions at the community center. At first, only a handful of kids showed up, watching the officers cautiously. But word spread quickly, and soon the center was buzzing with activity every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon. Jake found himself looking forward to these sessions more than any other part of his job. He watched as officers who'd initially been skeptical began to open up, sharing stories and jokes with the kids, learning about their lives and dreams. The change wasn't just in the kids' attitudes. He could see his fellow officers softening, becoming more invested in the community they served. One particular moment stood out to Jake. He was helping a young girl with her math homework when he overheard 2 other officers talking with some teenage boys about a recent incident in the neighborhood. Instead of the usual defensive stance he might have expected, the officers were actually listening, trying to understand the boys' perspective on why tensions had risen. The program's success didn't go unnoticed. Other precincts started asking about implementing similar initiatives. Local news stations ran stories about the positive changes in community police relations. But for Jake, the real measure of success came in smaller moments. The high fives from kids when he arrived for his shifts at the center, the grateful smiles from parents, the casual conversations with residents who no longer tensed up when they saw a patrol car. David remained deeply involved, often staying late to help coordinate activities or mentor kids one-on-one. Jake marveled at his ability to balance this volunteer work with his demanding job and other community commitments. How do you do it all? Jake asked one evening as they were closing up the center. David smiled, tossing a basketball into the storage bin. Same reason you're here, instead of just driving your patrol route. Because it matters. Because every kid who learns to see police officers as allies instead of enemies, every officer who learns to see these kids as individuals instead of potential problems, that's one step closer to the kind of community we all want to live in. The changes weren't limited to the youth program. Jake found himself approaching his regular patrol duties differently. He took time to talk with residents, learning their names and stories. He began to understand the neighborhood's rhythms, which houses always had lights on late because their owners worked night shifts, which corners were popular hangouts for local teens, which elderly residents might need an extra check during hot weather. Other officers noticed the change in him. Some were skeptical at first, but as they saw the positive responses he was getting from the community, they began to ask questions, to show interest in his approach. Jake shared what he'd learned, not as a superior telling others what to do, but as someone who discovered a better way to serve. Martinez commented on the change during one of their regular meetings. "You've come a long way from that night," she said. "But you know what impresses me most? You didn't just change yourself, you're helping change the whole department's culture." Jake thought about that as he drove home that evening. The sun was setting over Garden Heights, and he could see kids playing in front yards, families walking dogs, neighbors chatting on porches. This was the same neighborhood he'd patrolled before, but now he saw it differently. He saw people instead of potential threats, community instead of territory to control. A year had passed since that fateful traffic stop, and Garden Heights had transformed in ways nobody could have predicted. The community center, once quiet on weekday afternoons, now buzzed with activity. Kids rushed in after school, not just for basketball games and homework help, but for new programs that had sprung up organically from the initial youth outreach initiative. Jake sat in the back of the packed community center auditorium, watching as people filed in for what had become an annual celebration of community achievement. The walls were covered with photos from the past year, officers helping kids with science projects, teenagers and police playing basketball, community cleanup days where everyone worked side by side. David stood at the podium, accepting an award for his work in transforming police-community relations. The applause was genuine and warm, filling the room with a sense of shared pride. Jake remembered the night they'd first met, how different things could have turned out if David hadn't chosen to transform a negative experience into an opportunity for change. "When people ask me what's special about our community," David began, his voice carrying clearly through the room, "I tell them it's not just about what we've accomplished. It's about how we got here. A year ago, many of us saw each other as obstacles, as problems to be solved. Today, we see each other as partners in making our neighborhood better." Jake noticed familiar faces in the crowd. Marcus, now accepted to the police academy with a full scholarship, Mrs. Peterson, who'd started a weekly dinner where officers and residents could share meals and conversation, Mr. Richards, whose grandson had become a regular volunteer at the center. Each face had a story. Each person had contributed to the change they were celebrating. David continued, "But this award isn't just mine. It belongs to everyone who believed that we could do better. To the kids who gave us a chance to prove ourselves. To the officers who are willing to step out of their comfort zones and really get to know the people they serve." He paused, looking directly at Jake. "Would Officer Matheson please join me up here?" Jake felt his face flush as heads turned toward him. He hadn't expected this. As he made his way to the podium, he passed by familiar faces, receiving encouraging smiles and supportive nods. This was no longer the neighborhood where he'd felt like an outsider, viewing every situation with suspicion. These were his neighbors now, his community. Standing beside David at the podium, Jake felt the weight of the moment. David turned to address him directly, but his words were meant for everyone. "A year ago, Officer Matheson and I had an encounter that could have ended very differently. Instead, it became the catalyst for something remarkable." Jake didn't just apologize, he committed to making real change, not just in himself, but in how our entire community approaches police-community relations. Jake took the microphone, his heart pounding. "When I think back to that night," he began, "I'm not proud of how I acted, but I am proud of what we've built since then. Every day, I see officers stopping to play basketball with kids, helping with homework, really listening to residents' concerns. I see teenagers who used to avoid police now considering careers in law enforcement. I see neighbors looking out for each other instead of looking at each other with suspicion." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "But most importantly, I see hope. Hope in the faces of kids who no longer fear the police. Hope in the officers who've learned that true strength comes from building trust, not asserting authority. Hope in a community that's shown that change is possible when we're willing to work for it together." The celebration continued into the evening, with food and music and conversation flowing freely. Jake found himself in a corner with David, watching as off-duty officers played games with local kids, as elderly residents shared stories with rookie cops, as teenagers helped younger children with art projects. "Did you ever imagine this?" Jake asked, gesturing to the scene before them. "That night, when you pulled over, did you think any of this was possible?" David smiled, shaking his head. "Honestly, no. I was just trying to get to dinner." They both laughed at that. But you know what? Sometimes the best changes come from the most unexpected moments. It's not about what happens to us, it's about what we choose to do with it. As the evening wound down, Jake helped stack chairs and clean up, just another member of the community pitching in. He caught snippets of conversation, plans for new programs, ideas for expanding their initiatives to other neighborhoods, discussions about the upcoming police academy class where several local kids would be attending. The last rays of sunlight filtered through the windows as Jake and David stood in the parking lot, the sounds of families heading home echoing around them. "We've come a long way," Jake said, "but there's still work to do." David nodded. "There always will be. But now we know what's possible when we work together. That's worth everything." Jake watched as David walked to his car, the same black Mercedes from that fateful night. But now, instead of seeing a potential threat, Jake saw a friend, a partner in making their community better. As he headed to his own car, Jake smiled, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to learn and grow, and new chances to prove that change wasn't just possible, it was inevitable when people chose to move forward together.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.